one note is off, it eventually destroys the whole symphony, David.
Never really reacted like parents. If it was my daughter that had been killed, I'd be sitting at the police department every day.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear. Thoughts build up until I can't hear. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear. The thoughts build up until I can't hear. That my mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. In the previous analysis, we dealt with 10 mistakes in the first 20 minutes or so, CNN special report. Now we're going to deal with another 10 more mistakes, and again it starts very early. At 19 minutes 46 seconds, John Ramsey says it's total fiction that we wouldn't talk to the police. Let's listen in.
And so much publicity saying the Ramseys wouldn't talk with police.
No, that's total fiction. We talked to them in the home, went down the basement, talked to them. They kept persisting, we got to take you down to the police station.
You really want to watch John Ramsey's body language when he's confronted by the CNN reporter 20 years after the incident. As I said, it's about 19 minutes, 46 seconds, about this whole idea of not talking to the police. Because that is, I think, a very, very strong point, potentially. He does a tongue lash, and then he scratches the back of his head. This is something you might want to watch a couple of times. Now, John calls it a total fiction, the idea that the Ramseys didn't want to talk to the police. What do you think? If you just clear your mind, just make it a kind of a blank space. Do you think the Ramseys wanted to talk to the police? Do you think they did talk to the police or not? Well, to CNN's credit, the reporter then points out, kind of in an off-screen narration, she points out that the Ramseys gave their first interview to CNN, not to law enforcement. It's a subtle point, I suppose. I mean, it's not that subtle. But in John's defense, one could say that they did talk to the police. For example, when they greeted them at the door and when Patsy called 911. But more specifically, what's being asked here is, after JonBenet's body was found, so more specifically, more explicitly, how long did it take before the Ramseys sat down, both of them, for a formal interview, for formal questioning? And the answer is 4 months. On the 1st of May 1997, in other words, immediately following their first interview with the police, the Ramseys then gave another press conference. At the time, an article appeared in the Washington Post, which reads as follows. 4 months after their 6-year-old daughter was found slain in their own home, the parents of JonBenet Ramsey met with police to answer questions. Is that total fiction? Boulder Police Chief Tom Kobe and District Attorney Alex Hunter said that John and Patricia Ramsey met separately with 2 detectives and a representative of the Boulder County DA's office. No arrests have been made and no suspects named in the murder of the child beauty pageant contestant. JonBenet's body was found December 26th by her father in the basement of the family's home, about 8 hours after her mother said she found a ransom note demanding $118,000. Since then, this is the part to emphasize, the parents' lawyers have been negotiating terms of interviews with the investigators who have taken several examples of Patricia Ramsey's handwriting. And so what that kind of looks like and sounds like is that the police want to talk to the Ramseys, but the Ramseys' lawyers are saying, well, we'll negotiate. We'll decide how we're going to do that. Does that seem like someone who's completely volunteering, completely cooperative, trying to be as forthcoming as possible, as early as possible? Anyway, the last paragraph of this article reads, last week, after police said the parents were the focus of the murder investigation, attorneys for the parents said that police cancelled interviews that had been scheduled, and they accused police of waging a smear campaign against them. Before we get to the rest of this episode, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. By the way, I do want to be continuing the analysis of this question. Did the Ramseys were they cooperating or what is the story? Were the police not cooperating? What is the problem? In a subsequent episode, if you're interested in that, please let me know in the comments, because we will then just look at a specific article that deals with that. If you're enjoying this episode, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. What I think is very interesting is this idea of going on CNN a week after the incident and creating PR, public relations essentially, around this idea of what they say happened, and also around the idea of a ransom note. In both cases, there's a sort of noisy interference that sort of distracts from the investigation. Let me say that again. It's really interesting that in this case, you kind of got a ransom note that comes to the fore that interferes with whatever your ideas are of what could have happened, and also to some extent with the reality of what did happen. That, and then the idea of going on to CNN about a week after the incident, one day after JonBenet's funeral, and doesn't that also provide a kind of noisy interference in terms of what the police are trying to investigate? I also find it interesting that after the fact, when asked whether they spoke to the police, John says they did, and he refers to the claim that they didn't as pure fiction. I just find his turn of phrase quite interesting, because I remember a similar-ish turn of phrase when he was asked about Burke hitting JonBenet with a golf club. In the Ramsey's second interview, which happened a year later, and it happened a year later in 1998 because the cops weren't satisfied with what they were told during the first interview, John Ramsey uses the word pure accident when this sort of narrative comes up. Let's quickly review that. Mike Cain says, do you remember the day after this happened being on the phone talking to someone about getting your golf clubs? John Ramsey says, no, absolutely not. Now, again, one wonders, where would that thought or idea come from that the police are actually asking about it? Anyway, Mike Cain says, okay, from what I've read, JonBenet had an injury at one time to her face. What do you know about that? John Ramsey answers, Burke was up at the lake and Burke was in the yard swinging a golf club, and she walked, meaning JonBenet, walked up either in front of Burke or behind him. He says, I was not there, and JonBenet got clobbered. It was a pure accident. Those are John Ramsey's words. Pure accident, pure fiction. But how does John know it was a pure accident if he wasn't there himself? In CNN's defense, this isn't a mistake, because they do highlight the difference between what John said, meaning that they did speak to the police, and then what happened. I would have liked them to be more explicit about volunteering for a media interview right in the beginning while resisting or delaying or setting conditions for the police interview for several months later. The issue is around formal questioning. That is kind of the question. Were you willing to undergo formal questioning, or why weren't you willing? And then I think more than 20 years after the fact, it's not easy to get information online about the timeline leading up to those first police interviews. It's difficult, but it's not impossible. For example, there is this article from the local news outlet, the Daily Camera. And this is a quick quote from that article. There was a lot of fighting going on between police and the Ramseys last week about interrogating the Ramseys, but police finally got to officially talk to them about the details of the day the body was found and other things like family history. It really wasn't as informative as it could have been, and that was something that was mentioned. Boulder authorities began requesting a formal recorded interrogation with the couple after December 26. And so it took 4 months from then for it to happen. So, as I say, I would have liked the interviewer to have stressed, but you didn't consent to formal interviews for 4 months. Because technically, as I say, John could argue that they did talk to the cops in the way that that question was framed. There's a lot more to say about the stops and starts and legal wheeling and dealing. As I said, I'd love to carry on with that in a follow-up, so let me know if you'd be interested in the comments. What led to the first police interview in the end. But if we deal with that here now, we won't get to the other 9 issues. So perhaps we can leave that for an episode of its own. I do think it's important and necessary to be as unsubtle sometimes as we can be, that on the question about when the Ramseys gave formal interviews to the police, it was 4 long months after JonBenet's death. This also wasn't because the police were dragging their heels or because the police weren't sure they wanted to talk to the Ramseys. They knew they wanted to talk to the Ramseys. The Ramseys were their priority. So I think in a global sense, if you're wondering why this case has taken so long to solve, or why there was so little progress or so little transparency for the first 3 years of JonBenet's death, I think you can say formally talking to the cops twice in 2 years isn't going to help. The special report also quotes Officer Fred Patterson as saying he thought the Ramseys' behavior was odd in the sense that if he had lost a child, he'd be camped out at the police station trying to get justice. And so within this simple dynamic, one wonders how many answers there are.
Yeah, that was a mistake. It was a decision we made, but not under our right state of mind.
In retrospect, how do you feel about the ransom note? Was that a mistake? What was the frame of mind of whoever wrote that? Because I think you can argue the ransom note, lengthy and flawed, did actually work. Where we are now, I'm not sure one can say in a legal setting, in a legal context, unambiguously and as a fact, that Patsy wrote the ransom note. So whoever wrote it succeeded, didn't they? The other side is that one can never say handwriting 100% belongs to anyone, and because there is always a sense of uncertainty. But one has to wonder whether John really regrets going onto CNN. Again, looking in hindsight at the outcome for them and the outcome for where the case is now. One could also say if he really regretted going onto CNN on January 1st, 1997, then why did he go on CNN repeatedly afterwards? He was on Larry King, promoting their book and discussing the case with Detective Thomas, and here he is again in 2016. So do you think it's true that it was a mistake? Do you think there was any impairment to states of mind? Bear in mind, John used to be a CEO of a big business. He was used to high stress. Patsy's won pageants, some of them pretty big pageants. These are people who can handle stress and handle the media. This is not so much a mistake as an observation. Do you notice when she says there's someone out there, notice how she's shaking her head? That is at 20 minutes 40 seconds in the special report. Now on to number 4.
And suspects.
This is another thing that made this suitable for the tabloids. I mean, on the suspect list is Santa Claus.
So at this point, CNN shows a number of suspects. It happens just before the 20-minute mark. I don't think 20 years after the fact that one can repeat that Gary Oliver is still a suspect, or that the housekeeper is still a suspect, or that Santa Claus is still a suspect, or that any of them are still suspects. They haven't been suspects for more than a decade, so why are they being bandied about as such?
That was something JonBenet and Patsy did for fun. We loved our children dearly.
So we dealt with this in some detail. We touched on this during the first analysis, and I do think it's an interesting issue. Was it really fun for JonBenet? It's an important but difficult question. The best person to answer it is JonBenet, but there are some clues regarding JonBenet's feelings about pageants which strike me as ambivalent. According to the family photographer Judith Phillips, she said in an interview, quote, "My daughter later told me that during one of her visits that during this time that she went up to JonBenet's room and JonBenet showed her all the trophies from all the pageants, her ribbons and stuff like that. And my daughter said, 'What are these?' And JonBenet said, 'Oh, my mom just wants me to get into these pageants, and these are trophies that I earned.' And my daughter said, 'Wow, cool.' She said that JonBenet said that the trophies really don't belong here. They belong in my mom's room." Yeah. Well, that counter-narrative seems almost too good to be true in terms of getting JonBenet's words, apparently verbatim. But within this schema, how do we get them? How do we get JonBenet's point of view on a particular topic? Like, JonBenet, do you like being in these pageants? Well, one way to do that is by another child, and once you do that, you come down to the level that JonBenet is, and you see what they talking about and thinking about, and you come into the context of child psychology. And that's what I think has been missing all along in this case. The best people to ask about the JonBenet Ramsey case aren't the parents or random adult strangers or intruders, but rather JonBenet's peers, her classmates, her siblings and their siblings.
We just didn't trust the police for good reason. They put out volumes of misinformation and false information to bring pressure on us.
But I think the flip side of that argument is that the Ramseys have put out a lot of information themselves. Who do you suspect? You know, those leads never went anywhere. This year, John Ramsey was on court TV, seemingly supporting or at least adding his voice or simply appearing in a discussion about suspicion related to Gary Oliva. Has that turned out to be trustworthy? Whoever wrote the ransom note, was that trustworthy, or was it voluminous misinformation? Also, for years, the world was led to believe that the grand jury hadn't voted to indict the Ramseys when in fact they had. Anyway, on to number 7.
JonBenet had been the victim of a violent attack.
This is where I think CNN have made a direct mistake. And this is where attention to details matter, and where a single word either takes you in the wrong direction or the right direction. You might take issue with me criticizing the use of the word violent and say, well, obviously it was. And indeed, it does make sense to imagine, given JonBenet's multiple injuries, that some violence was done to her. So I'm not saying violence is necessarily completely incorrect. Instead, I have a suggestion for a better word, and that word is clumsy, to say that the attack on JonBenet was clumsy. If someone wanted to kill JonBenet, they didn't need to use more than one weapon. You know, if the idea was asphyxia, why not simply use her pillow or the blanket? Why spend time building and fashioning a garrote? The duct tape is also clumsy, along with the string tied loosely to her wrists. The duct tape is clumsy because it was applied post-mortem. We know this because a perfect imprint of her lips were found on the sticky side of it, which wouldn't have been the case if she struggled or tried to cry out. If the duct tape was applied post-mortem, it suggests similar pageantry to the ransom note. I also think the sexual aspect, though painful, was more clumsy and may even have involved a paintbrush, because they found what they thought may have been a tiny wooden fragment. I think they called it bifringent material, rather than, it seems like that was what was used rather than human anatomy. Now, whether you choose the word violent or clumsy, it's going to give you a fuzzy sense of who the real perpetrator is, isn't it? And just choosing between those two words is going to take you down, it's going to take you to a fork in the road, and you're either going to take the one or the other. Violent makes us think of Gary Oliva, and I think most people do, because the narrative around this case has been successfully distorted, including here by CNN. On to number 8.
This was a forceful impact. This was not something that could be done by just normal roughhousing or playing around.
Dr. Daniel Spitz, Chief Medical Examiner for Macomb County, seems to think the injuries to JonBenet were deliberate. Now, to say that it was forceful, it wasn't executed by playing around, by just playing around. I don't believe that. As severe as the head injury was, the scalp tissue, the skin on JonBenet's head didn't even break. And because there was no obvious sign, even the pathologist didn't really know that she'd received a head injury until the autopsy was sort of in an advanced stage. We can talk about the sort of object that could have made this injury, but the critical part is that it made this injury without breaking the skin. But we won't do that analysis here. Suffice it to say, I don't believe it was the flashlight, and I doubt whether it was the golf club. I also think the fact that JonBenet in the past was hit with a golf club in the face and required plastic surgery, I mean, she was hospitalized, demonstrates two possibilities. Number one, a golf club would cause an obvious scar and break the skin. Number two, John believes the injury on that occasion was accidental, which means one could have serious injuries in a playful setting. Now number 9.
Following that impact, the assailant placed a tightly applied ligature around her neck.
I don't believe that.
I believe the ligature was placed around her neck before the impact, well before it, and the idea wasn't to kill or even torture JonBenet. It was a form of play. It's also possible that if JonBenet knew the person, and bear in mind there is that heart-shaped drawing on her palm, she may have innocently consented to whatever was going on. Remember, there were ligatures around her wrist as well that weren't tight. These would also have taken time to put in place and would have been difficult to apply without JonBenet's cooperation or consent, well, at least according to that theory. Again, if the purpose was to kill JonBenet, then why tie her hands? Also, if the idea was to forcefully control JonBenet, why weren't her wrists tied more tightly or placed behind her back where her hands couldn't interfere with what was going on? And why apply the duct tape after everything? And now on to the 10th and final mistake.
And when they were through, they pulled that cord very hard.
I don't believe that.
Yeah, so I don't believe that either. A child's scream was heard by neighbors close to 2 a.m. I think one has to ask what prompted the scream, and also how was she able to scream if she had duct tape on her mouth, was tied up, and had a ligature around her neck. Interestingly, the scream was reported to have stopped abruptly. Was the ligature applied to prevent or stop the scream? If so, then what was its purpose? Was the purpose to silence JonBenet, to control her making a noise? Well, if that was the purpose, it wasn't to kill or to murder. Anyway, that is 10 mistakes, although not all are necessarily CNN's fault. We've only progressed 3 minutes into the second half of CNN's segment. Do you want me to go on? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.